Welcome to a Prevent Connect podcast, where we explore the prevention of violence against women. This is a project of the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault.
Sure. Wow. And thank you for being here. We know that we were up against a lot of other amazing sessions, including Tarana Burke in this time period. So just really appreciate such a great turnout here, and hope everyone can find a seat. And please do feel free throughout the whole session, if you have a pressing question, sort of raise your hand so we see you, and we'll get you the microphone and try to work those in as we go. We also do hope to have a good time for a really open, collaborative discussion and conversation at the end of things today. So my name is Brian Heilman. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm a senior research officer at Promundo, which is what we'll describe a little bit about what Promundo is as we come here. But I guess I have the real honor of being a little bit of the link between the two programs that we're presenting to you today. Promundo supervises a program called Manhood 2.0, which we'll talk about that took place in Pittsburgh and in Washington, D.C. But I happen to, even though I work with Promundo, which is based in D.C., I live and work in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And through my work in collaboration with my friend Brett, as an advocate with our local sexual violence center, I have facilitated on a volunteer basis the high school program in Minnesota that we're going to talk about. So I'm very, very thrilled, actually, to be combining my personal advocacy with professional work here. So we'll have, I don't want to steal the floor from my fellow presenters, but you'll have a chance. We have an introductions thing coming. So here's where we're going to go with you today. We'll start with a little bit of an interactive activity to get our heads around the kinds of messages and activities that we were doing with high school students in these programs. Then we'll kind of introduce ourselves and our organizations. My colleague Apta will walk us through a little bit of what we mean when we're talking about a gender transformative program approach for the prevention of sexual violence, briefly to bring our frame there. But then quite a lot of the focus is about these two different gender transformative sexual violence prevention programs, one of which took place in Pittsburgh under the name Manhood 2.0, and the other in a high school in Minnesota, which we call self-advocacy. So each of those will get 15 minutes or so. We'll present how they went and what we're trying to learn and bring into this space for discussion today. And then, we'll have a chance to look back, synthesize, and really open the floor to everyone here. But, as promised, we thought we would start with a little bit of an interactive activity. There won't be too much onus on you all to talk amongst yourselves. I know that could be a little awkward sometimes. We'll keep it a good balance. But we wanted to get our heads around what we really mean by these gender transformative messages and program approaches. And I think it's also important, right out front in the beginning of the presentation, to say that there is going to be a lot of language that seems to reflect a binary view of gender in some of the slides that we talk about here, and that in no way is us trying to reinforce that reality or exclude those who identify outside the gender binary. We just we feel that it's very important, and this is what we do with the students we're working with, is to kind of name the enemy, so to speak, or see the problematic views of gender in order to deconstruct them and transform them. So I hope that makes sense to everyone, and we can discuss that later. But to the extent that binary language appears here, it's in a way that we're trying to name it, bring it into our attention so that we can all the more effectively deconstruct it. And so to wade right into that right now, we're going to do an activity that maybe some of y'all have done before, but just really want everyone to think for a moment about some of the words, some of the images, some of the phrases, ideas that come to mind when you hear the phrase, be a man. Be a real man. I'm even performing it in my voice. Be a real man. So shout them out. Can you name any images or ideas that come to mind with that phrase? Don't cry. Protector. No emotions except anger. I wish I had candy bars to throw to these good answers. Don't take no for an answer. Very relevant. Yeah, more. Physical dominance. No real intimacy. Good. Challenge. Challenge accepted. Yeah. Even that like self-reliance, like you're up for anything no matter what. You can't admit that you're afraid to do something. Sure. Always being on guard. Yeah. The protective or that like toughness. Sure. Powerful. Yeah. Alpha. Good. Let's see how many, like, these are the ideas that we talked about. Don't cry, somebody said that. Powerful, alpha, athletic is also there, to bring it around to the topic of sexual violence and sexual relationships. The idea that you are probably almost certainly of a heterosexual identity if you're being this real man vision, and also that you are sexually experienced, you kind of pursue sexual relationships in this conquest kind of way. These are mainstream associations and ideas that are tied up with what it means to be a real man. Now that's not to say that any people who identify as men in the room or those of us who have relationships with people who identify as men really want to be this necessarily. A lot of us like define our identity precisely by throwing this out. But this research that Promundo does and our experience with our high school students tells us that unfortunately these ideas are alive and well across our country and around the world, and so that's kind of what we're up against. But to dive a little bit deeper into what this looks like, okay, and I should give just a little bit of a, content warning that there are going to be some kind of insulting, derogatory words that appear up here, and I hope just let you know that's coming next. What might a young man hear, or any person hear, if they fail to live up to this singular, narrow definition of being a man? Yeah, acts like a girl. What might they be called? Sure. Sissy. Pussy. Fag. Yeah, you're the expert crowd. I mean, you really can tell what community we're working with here. Yeah, so I just mean you all are schooled in this gender transformative approach already. You like full marks, 100% score so far. Right, so like also if you fail to live up to this identity, society will use these insults, these very gendered insults to try to push you back in and tell you that you don't belong. And our research, our programs, and even probably everyone's here's like innate experience and instinct shows that this is not healthy, this is not good for people. This conflict doesn't lead to confident identities, doesn't lead to people really respecting their own identity and feeling like they're good enough the way they are. We also know that it leads to all these harmful outcomes and links with things like perpetration of physical violence, bullying, self-directed harm as well as harm to others, sexual violence and harassment. It's the kind of language of exclusion in social groups in a high school setting. So all of this is called the man box. Right, and it's an activity and a discussion frame that's been kind of in the social science literature about gender for many decades before Promundo ever picked it up and used it. But it's also something that we incorporate into the high school programs that we're discussing today and that we've asked the boys in those rooms to feed into. And so it kind of felt like it would be useful to start there so you get a sense of what those classrooms feel like. But I think Apta wants to take this even a little bit deeper with Promundo's research.
So we're going to go from a rather fun activity to pop quiz. So in 2017, Promundo, supported by Unilever and Axe, conducted a survey, we call it the Man Box Study, where we asked young men from the US, the UK, and Mexico, ages 18 to 35, about some of the ideas and norms that they hold, as well as what society tells them about being a man in relationships. So we're just going to go through a few series of statements, and I'd like you, we unfortunately cannot move around the room, though I do like to kind of do a vote with your feet activity. And we'll do three statements, And I'd like you to raise your hand at the kind of percentage range that you think best represents how the number of men who, in the US, who agreed and strongly agreed with this statement. So the percentages would be 10 to 30%, 31% to 55%, or 56% to 75%.
Ready?
Yep. So the first statement. Society as a whole tells me that a real man should have as many sexual partners as he can. What is the percent of men in the US who agreed or strongly agreed with this? Raise your hand if you think 10 to 30%. Raise your hand if you think 31 to 55%. Okay. Raise your hand if you think 56 to 75%. Majority. Yeah. 60% of men in the US agreed or strongly agreed with this statement, compared with 51% in the UK and 42% in Mexico. Second statement. Society as a whole tells me that guys should act strong even if they feel scared or nervous inside. How many believe 10 to 30% of young men in the US agreed or strongly agreed with this statement? Okay. What about 31 to 55%? One person. And then what about 56 to 75%? All of you. 75% compared with 64% in the UK and 59% in Mexico. And then the last statement, in my opinion, if a guy has a girlfriend or a wife, he deserves to know where she is at all times. So 10 to 30%. One person. 31 to 55%. Okay, quite a few, majority of you. And then 56 to 75%. Few of you, okay. 46% agreed or strongly agreed with this statement, compared with 37% in the UK and 26% in Mexico.
I guess you all read the report already. I mean, flattered.
So this kind of gives an overview of what kind of the need for working with young men, especially in the US, on a lot of these rigid gender norms are. There are high percentages. We tend to kind of stereotype or stigmatize other countries, not we in this room, but others tend to do that. And really there's a real need to address this issue and around gender norms and masculinity here in the US as well. So who are we? I'm Opta Garg. I'm a program officer with Promundo. Brian, my colleague, introduced himself as well. We both work at Promundo, which is an international organization that was started in Rio de Janeiro in 1997. We are an applied research organization, which means what we do is we work across different areas. We work on research, programs, and advocacy. So we do programs informed by evidence and research and build upon those programs to create advocacy for a structural change. We work in over 40 countries around the world and have offices, independently registered offices in Brazil, the US, Portugal, and the DRC. And a number of different areas that we work in are listed over here. We work on programs on conflict and security, working with men who have been affected by trauma in post-conflict areas. Economic justice, working with male partners of women involved in women's economic empowerment programs around the world. Fatherhood and caregiving, working on advocacy for expanding parental leave around the world as well as in the US. Preventing violence, which is a core component of all of our programs, as well as research for action, including the Man Box study that I just referenced. And then youth inequality, which we'll talk a little bit more about today with our Manhood 2.0 work. Some of the things that we believe in. Gender equality is an essential part of creating happier and healthy societies for everyone. If we don't get to the root of gender inequities, then we're not going to be building the healthy, stable societies that we want to see in the world. And that in order to do this, we need to involve men and boys as part of the solution to achieve gender equality. What we know is that men and boys are also impacted and harmed by rigid gender norms, including some of the ways that Brian mentioned through the Man Box. And so if we don't involve them, we're not going to be building those societies that we want to see. And we also believe that by not involving men and boys, it creates undue burden on women and girls and other communities to be responsible with creating their own change, with catalyzing or dismantling their own oppression. So we need to involve men and boys as part of that achieving gender equality. Using gender transformative solutions in order to achieve that change that we want to see, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. Tapping into voices of resistance. Through our research, we know that in every context, even in the most conservative environments, there are those who live and believe in gender equality and in the change that we want to see, and we need to uplift, support, and promote them as role models for our communities. Working from a lens of intersectionality, so that understanding that individuals have multiple identities that act as barriers and challenges for them achieving access to resources and opportunities, and then working within a feminist framework as well.
Okay, I think we want to make sure Liz has a chance to introduce her affiliation too.
Hi, very quickly, I'm Liz Miller. It's an immense privilege to be here. I direct adolescent and young adult health. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and we'll have an opportunity in a little bit after Opta gives you sort of a background on gender transformative programming to share some of the work that we've been doing in Pittsburgh.
Yeah, I don't know if you wanted to.
Oh, no, we can skip that.
Okay.
We love taking care of young people. It's a good summary.
Great. Okay, and then Brett.
Hello, everybody. I'm really excited to be here with you all today. My name is Brett. I use he or they gender pronouns. I'm currently a PhD candidate at Arizona State University at the School of Social Transformation, focusing on masculinities and violence and the potential for restorative, transformative, or transitional justice to respond and prevent sexual violence, to sort of replace the criminal justice system, which fails communities, it fails survivors, and it fails perpetrators. I kind of came to that work. My background is in activism and community organizing. I was in New York City for a long time. Got a lot of experience through Occupy Wall Street and Occupy Sandy, which was a community-based hurricane relief and recovery network, and came to gender-based work through community organizing. So through, I met Brian at the Sexual Violence Center in Minneapolis, which we'll talk about in just a second, doing direct service advocacy work. And so to combine a bunch of the different hats and my various interests, I founded this website, and it's now a nonprofit organization called The Bridges We Burn. Shameless plug, if you go to page 57 in your programs, we took out an ad to really get some awareness about what we do. And what do we do? It started as a resource center. When I was getting my master's, it was really hard for me to find useful information that wasn't reactive, that was thinking longer term, that was really invested in intersectionality and different systems of power, that investigates the way white supremacy is dependent on neoliberal capitalism and how that all feeds into toxic masculinity. And so I just said, well, if it's not out there, I'm going to start doing it. So I'm collecting resources. There's original writing that is very personal from different folks. A lot of it is my writing and is trying to come at it from an academic and an activist standpoint. So it's hopefully very approachable, but also challenging. And so there's original writing, links to resources, different things that are interesting, and we develop curriculum, programming, consultant work around all of these topics. And like I mentioned, Brian and I met at the Sexual Violence Center, which is the main rape crisis center in Minnesota, but is structurally sort of limited to 3 counties involving Minneapolis and its direct neighboring areas, not including St. Paul. We provide direct service advocacy, 24-hour crisis line, one-to-one counseling, support groups, and community education, which the program that Brian and I developed came out of the community ed sort of wing of things. We'll get into why we call it community ed and not necessarily prevention. Yeah, I think anything else about SVC?
that's probably it. Yeah. Okay, so we're ready to hand over to Apta to talk about gender transformative programming.
So, kind of a show of hands, how many people have worked with the gender transformative approach or understand kind of the terminology and what that means? So quite a few of you, great. Great, so just to kind of give an overview and a background, when we think about programs that try and address gender and gender norms, we think of them through kind of this gender integration continuum, which is how deeply does the program or the intervention actually incorporate an understanding of gender and gender norms, gender roles, and responsibilities. And we categorize them from, there's those gender blind programs or gender neutral programs that supposedly don't integrate gender at all, but really actually just by ignoring them are impacting them. But then there's also those on the gender integration continuum, those that are harmful and foster inequality, that reinforces those stereotypes about gender roles and really reinforces the structures and inequities that exist, to those that are transformative and promote equality and changes those structures. I won't go too deeply. That basically says what I said. I won't go too deeply into gender exploitative approaches. That's not really the focus of our conversation today, but really focus on gender accommodating or sensitive versus gender transformative. So an example that I'd like to read is a young men's clinic for low-income men in an urban city that incorporates messages about the importance of seeking and receiving health services, but does not challenge the underlying gender issues that keep men from seeking services in the first place. Does anyone have an idea why we would consider this more gender accommodating versus gender transformative?
Because you don't try to encourage, change the system of thinking that would encourage them to get help in the first place.
So gender accommodating or gender sensitive programming, they know, they understand gender norms and the existing barriers that exist for communities, but don't necessarily try to actively change those norms or those roles and responsibilities, rather just kind of work to accommodate them. And usually the reason why we shy away is that while they are a good first step, and usually in many communities, the only first step to entering into communities, they're often a missed opportunity to kind of change those barriers that exist. The next example is a program that sensitizes healthcare providers to gender-related stigma and discrimination faced by men who have sex with men and transgender clients, and trains the providers to provide appropriate services without stigmatizing those clients. This challenges normative thinking of healthcare providers, reduces gender-based stigma and mistreatment, and improves health outcomes for these clients. So kind of back to what you were saying, we see gender transformative approaches as kind of more actively attempting to examine and challenge those norms that exist and the imbalance of power between men and women, as well as others in the community. And the reason why we worked with a gender transformative lens or approach is that they work to foster critical examination of gender norms, roles, and relationships. They challenge the distribution of resources and allocation of duties between men and women and others in the community. They address the power relationships between women and others in the community, including service providers, who also themselves hold a lot of these biases, and promote the relative position of women, girls, and marginalized groups. We also understand through a gender transformative lens that these norms don't just exist at the individual level, but really exist both at between relationships, that gender is a relational aspect, in the community and in structures. So through a gender transformative approach, we try and work at all of these different levels, working with individuals, building relationships, positive, healthy relationships, working with community structures to support those new ideas and new norms, and then through advocacy and policy, changing those structures to create more sustainable change in the long term. So that brings us into the interventions, the two programs that we're going to be talking about today, which is Manhood 2.0. I'll start with Manhood 2.0 rather. Manhood 2.0 is based on a gender transformative program from Promunda that was started in 2002 called Program H for hombres or homens in Spanish and Portuguese. It is a manual. The manual itself is a series of interactive activities and dialogue and a community campaign curricula that works to address themes such as sexual and reproductive health, fatherhood, violence, power, gender, as well as HIV and AIDS. It has been culturally adapted in over 30 countries around the world, including in 2 sites in the US, one in Pittsburgh and one in DC. And it's usually where we seek to implement is within schools or youth programs or sports clubs. Institutions where a lot of these ideas and roles about what it means to be a man are created and reinforced for young men. And as I mentioned, kind of the 3 components of Program H and Manhood 2.0, I'm going to kind of use those 2 interchangeably since they're the same program, is that they have those interactive activities where young men begin to think critically about gender, about power and dynamics, about relationships, and then promote through group dialogue, discuss with their peers about how they understand these norms, how they can challenge them, and what might be some of the barriers or missed opportunities for doing so. What are their fears about challenging some of those rigid gender norms? And then lastly, combining it with either a community mobilization campaign or a personal commitment to action so that young men can bring these new ideas, these new understandings about masculinity, and bring them into their communities as well to create the change that they want in their lives. This is just a little bit of an overview of our theory of change about how through Manhood 2.0 and Program H, young men can learn, rehearse these new skills and ideas and norms, internalize them, and then live the gender equitable lives that they want to see, all with the support of a community institution to help make sure that they have that kind of backing that they need to foster new and healthier masculinities. Over the years, we've collected a lot of evidence about the Program H itself. Liz will go a little bit more into our RCT in Pittsburgh, but internationally, what we've seen with Program H is that it's improved gender equitable attitudes in nearly all sites of implementation. It's had reductions in violence supportive attitudes, a decrease in sexual harassment, increase in condom use, and for young women in Brazil, they reported that their male partners treated them with more respect, sought HIV testing, and then participated in contraceptive use. In terms of how this program and this curriculum has impact, what we've seen is that one of the central components to effectiveness is questioning what it means to be a man as a central component of the program. Really kind of, and through every activity and every session, repeating, how does this relate to the man box? How does this relate to my conceptions of what I'm told to, my conceptions of manhood and what I'm told is what a real man is, and then really dismantling and deconstructing that. Consistently implementing the groups with well-trained facilitators, the quality of the facilitators from their own community have a true impact in really being able to support these young men. Longer duration, so more sessions over a longer period of time has had deeper impact than shorter sessions, as well as multiple components, as I mentioned, working both individually, like within relationships and then within the community. Encouraging young men to speak out, community campaigns, advocating for policy and structural changes, and then most importantly, making sure that this curriculum, this manual, is adapted to be relevant to them and their needs, that it's always built and formed by the community in which we're working. One last thing I'll say is that we do understand that there are risks or limitations to this type of work, of working with masculinities and young men. And we understand that not all men and boys should be involved. That is something that's important to us. We work to try and create a safe space to really deconstruct some of these ideas, but understanding that that there are those that we shouldn't be necessarily integrating into this to create that safe space. Ensuring that women are seen as equal partners in decision making, and discouraging the use of this space as or discouraging young men from using this space as an opportunity to reinforce those stereotypes that exist, not allowing that kind of mistrust of women and intentions to be fostered in this group as well. And then always making sure that you're not reinforcing norms of men's control over women's health, access to opportunities as well. And I'll hand it over to Liz to talk a little bit more about what this means in Pittsburgh and with Manhood 2.0.
Excellent, thank you. So the story for the Pittsburgh story, I have to go back and sort of give you just a little bit of history and positioning. As the time when we were applying to CDC for the funding to actually do this research study, I had already had the privilege of evaluating coaching boys into men, and actually initially developed with my colleague in the back, Alan Heisterkamp, where we worked really closely together to develop the program together with Futures Without Violence, and then it evaluated this program. And as much as I really appreciate the critical importance of training athletic coaches to talk to their male athletes about challenging the hypermasculinity in sport, and to really develop athletes as leaders, this was still very, very superficial, and I had wanted very much to dive more deeply, and had admired Promundo's work from afar. And then I get a call from Andrew Levesque, who was working with Promundo at the time, saying, "Do you want to go to the prom?" And I was like, "Yes, I do. I do." And so we wrote this proposal together to do the first U.S. adaptation of Program H in the U.S. So what was really great about Program H was it was unabashedly situated in reproductive justice, sexual health rights, and it was like a mashup of everything I've always wanted to do around adolescent sexuality, and to talk about internet pornography and media literacy around porn, tied with sexual violence prevention, talking about intimacy, and challenging toxic masculinity. Needless to say, I didn't want to go in front of a school board. Right, and so we actually wrote this proposal in partnership with, and I think earlier I saw Allison Hall here, but from Pittsburgh Action Against Rape, which is our local rape crisis counseling agency, and another victim service agency called Center for Victims, and with the YMCA and the Urban League of Greater Pittsburgh, as well as a number of smaller youth-serving agencies, with the idea that we would do a community-based prevention program. And so that is where Manhood 2.0 came. The name itself, actually, I have to admit, when I wrote the proposal, I said, we're going to call this U.S. adaptation Boys Care. And the young people were like, yeah, no, not. And so they came up with Manhood 2.0, and that has really stuck. And this was funded by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention as a cooperative agreement, and it was really to develop this gender transformative curriculum with adolescent boys to reduce the rates of adolescent dating violence and sexual violence. And we were going to set this up as a cluster randomized control trial. And so Pittsburgh is a very, very segregated city. And we have the privilege of working in 21 of our lower resource neighborhoods with a lot of concentrated disadvantage, with very high rates of school push-out. And one of the things that we were able to arrange with a number of the school districts was to set up this program as an alternative to suspension. And so our goal was reaching young people who are at high risk for push-out, and encouraging them to participate. And here is kind of the map. So we've been all over the map, as you can see in Pittsburgh. But there's another piece around the ethics of doing this work in community, which was that I really could not ethically go into these communities to recruit young men to be in, and to take surveys in a comparison arm without actually offering some kind of intervention as well. And so we used in research speak what's called an attention control design, meaning that they got the same 18 hours of curriculum, usually spread out 3 hours at a time over a 6-week period. So as Opta was saying, trying to do this kind of over a period of time. And we picked job skills training as the comparison. thinking that that would be something that would be certainly appealing in these communities and would be unlikely to be challenging the masculinity norms, the sexual health education components, right? And you're going to nod because I'm going to tell you that I'm not sure, because both of them look like they're both really helpful for young people. So in terms of the sexual violence prevention, I think I alluded to this, but the content is really sexual health promotion tied with sexual violence prevention. And the funding for the DC project actually came out of teen pregnancy prevention dollars, which very sadly are the ones that went away. And so that evaluation sort of has, it may come to a premature close. But what we were really hoping to be able to show is that in DC, they were evaluating more of the sexual health outcomes. In Pittsburgh, we were evaluating more of the sexual violence outcomes. Though being an adolescent clinician, of course, I'm interested in the sexual health outcomes, as well. The exposure to and use of porn, which was not actually originally in the Program H curriculum, we've really dug into more deeply because the young people I serve talk a lot about their exposure to sexually explicit material on the internet and really wanting more guidance on that. And then in terms of additional key adaptations, so we really worked to do this in a community-partnered way where all of our facilitators were community members. And so with each neighborhood in which we engaged, we identified kind of the Pied Piper in the community. Where were young people congregating? Was it in a church? Was it in a youth serving agency? Was there a library where a lot of teens were hanging out, and in the whole initial first year, we actually did asset mapping in every one of these neighborhoods to identify community agencies and community members who could really lead and hold this work. And so much of training for community members. And then we did certainly the gender messages integrated throughout into the sexual health curriculum. And also focused a lot on intersectionality. And so discussions of racism, white privilege, and male privilege as being a really key piece of this in addressing gender and sexuality. So for those who want to geek out, this is like the intervention part, which is, it's basically exploring gender norms, masculinity, and power, bringing in the sexual consent and sexual violence, and then the sexual health promotion towards the end. The sexual health promotion, usually one of the adolescent docs or nurses in my clinic will actually go to those sessions also, just in case some additional questions, come up along the way. But throughout that man box activity that Brian did at the beginning, that sort of sheet is actually put up at every session to keep going back to challenging those masculinity messages. And the control intervention is job skills training. So 21 neighborhoods, we randomized at the level of neighborhood, and this was because of the anticipation of diffusion effect, but I also couldn't train people in a community and say, okay, this week you're doing Manhood 2.0, and then next week you're gonna do job skills training. It just couldn't work that way, and so it was much easier to randomize at the level of neighborhood. Our target was 640, we got 870, actually 867 boys enrolled, and then followed them actually 9 months out to the end of the program, and then conducted a number of interviews with them. It is registered as a clinical trial, and the protocol, like this whole description of the intervention and so forth, is open access, meaning that you can Google the Manhood 2.0 and have the protocol there. So in terms of our demographics and so forth, this is high school age, about 15 years old. About 43% of the young people report that their parent did not complete high school, which is our proxy for socioeconomic status. And 77% identify as Black or African American. 93% were currently in school, and of those who dated, 93% reported dating mostly or only girls. In terms of sexual orientation, most identified as mostly or completely heterosexual, and 64% ever had had sexual contact with someone, and of those, 95% had contact with females only. 53% had ever had had vaginal or anal sex. So which was interesting. I think we had actually anticipated a much higher base rate of sexual activity. And then in terms of abuse perpetration, where we are at baseline, was about 8% reporting physical intimate partner violence, 5% sexual intimate partner violence with the use of force or threats. But then when you broaden the definition to include things like cyber, dating abuse, and emotional abuse, and so forth, about half of the young people are reporting adolescent relationship abuse perpetration. And these are more baseline data. So where we are at this point is doing lots and lots and lots of data, in particular because we have a site visit from the CDC next Tuesday. And so that, and I had alluded to, I think, what we're seeing is that actually in the control arm as well, job skills training, no surprise, helps young people's hope and future orientation. So we're actually seeing some reductions in violence perpetration, but in both arms. What we are also seeing is improvement in gender attitudes among young men. I'm still, we're still in that sort of preliminary stage where I'm not sure it's going to be, sort of a clear signal. Part of it has to do with the fact that when you randomize at the level of a neighborhood, despite the fact that you're like awesome sauce, Liz, you got 870 boys, right? For the statisticians in the room, it's really, with 21 clusters, our power actually drops dramatically. And so we will see, I think qualitatively, what we have heard from community members and the young men is that they were, and in fact, many of them were like, as the session ended, they're like, what's next? Can we keep coming back? Because they so appreciated having a safe space to have these conversations. And so the part that I'm going to leave you with that for me as a researcher has been the most joyous part of this is that I didn't want to go in and do a community partnered study, have the CDC dollars end, and then for us to pull out. And so in the past year have worked to convince our county's Department of Human Services to count this as part of prevention programming. And so they, as we described, working in neighborhoods, and I didn't tell you that many of our community partners now are Black churches, and so we have reverends and pastors who are also serving as facilitators. And I think our county prevention folks were so excited that we were doing work in communities and setting this up as an alternative to suspension. We're doing a lot of work with the Juvenile Probation Office, and so the part that's exciting is that we've continued to sort of take the support for the prevention programming. The part that you may have noticed when Opta talked about Program H was the community mobilization sort of aspect of this. And a decision that we made early on that I actually regret tremendously was that we chose not to have the community mobilization component in the research study because it was going to be really difficult to track like what exactly each group was doing. In any one neighborhood, we were running multiple rounds and so forth. So we were like, okay, we're just going to evaluate the curriculum. What we have done since is for young people who participated and completed Manhood 2.0 or the job skills training, they are now participating, if they want, in youth leadership and kind of youth activism. And really what's coming out of that is just so incredibly heartwarming. And so if I were to do this all over again, if somebody wants to give me more money to do it all over again, I would actually add that youth leadership component as a really critical piece. It was just going to be super difficult, as you can imagine, from like a controlled trial perspective to manage that. But I would certainly add in the community mobilization.
Okay, just a couple other like kind of housekeeping things that were coming to mind through this presentation so far were, one, that our slides are available on the conference download website. So you can go to calcasa.org/NSAC and like look up wherever it says, workshop resources and find our title. So I hope, because we were going through some of them kind of fast, so you can, if these are ever useful for you, they're available there. The other exciting thing is, just as of a couple months ago, the Manhood 2.0 curriculum itself is like fully up for free download on our website also. So we didn't have time to go, session by session, theme by theme, what are the actual classroom discussions which do get at, emotions and do get at violence and do get at gender identity and do get at breaking the binary and all these things. We're just it's part of our core ethos as Promundo to just put it up and make it free for everyone to have access to. So promundoglobal.org, and then there's a little search box, I guess you would put. It's right on the landing page. That's how excited we are. In addition to I know this is a US-based conference, but if anybody does international work or is interested in seeing the original like Latin America or Spanish language adaptations that had taken place in other places, those are also there under the name Program H, Program M, and so on. But now to move from one cultural capital of the United States in Pittsburgh to like another real cultural center in Minneapolis. We're going to speak briefly about a program that Brett and I created. And in a lot of ways, like part of why I was so compelled to pull together this presentation is that the contrast of a lot of the logistics of what you just heard about in Pittsburgh with what we did in Minneapolis are pretty big. As compared to something with a very rigorous, like city-wide evaluation design, federal government funding, a brand new, like internationally tested for decades curriculum in Pittsburgh. In Minneapolis, we had B&B, kind of like, we met as volunteer advocates at the Sexual Violence Center, and I guess if we just go right into the slide of how this all came to be, who, what, where, when, why. SVC had for a few years provided a support group within a youth, what would you call it? Actually a youth detention facility, right? And there was a teacher that was involved with that who then took a new job at this Minneapolis Public Schools high school and really appreciated SVC's work so much that she called up SVC and said, hey, I've got this, it's called a life skills class, which is really just a selected group of students that were having behavioral issues in the mainstream classrooms that were pulled out for a certain track for a certain part of the day. And she kind of just needed help and any good ideas in how to get through to these students and how to have meaningful connection with them and meaningful discussions. And she had good experiences with SVC. But SVC at the time, and still today, and I'm eager to hear people's reflection about this, our state grant through OVW very specifically restricted that we weren't really allowed to do prevention programming. There's no funding for prevention. We had nothing to draw from. And so at the time, Brett was being trained up in the volunteer advocacy. I was on board. I have this background working with Promundo, so I'm familiar with these curricula, and I was really excited about this opportunity. So it was sort of, we had this connection with a teacher, we had an interested advocate, but it kind of just depended on whatever skills and background I and Brett had brought and our willingness to take this on a volunteer basis. So I guess, if you can just imagine one public high school in a pretty poor neighborhood in northeast Minneapolis, on a given week, 10 to 20 students maximum. And these were, to this important question that was raised earlier, it's a particularly at risk, and maybe you'd even say a particularly stigmatized subsection of the student body, because these are students who are just having trouble in the day-to-day classroom. Most of them are on individualized learning plans. And there's a whole portion of the day where they just come to this kind of safe homeroom, and the teacher is doing their best. But it's sort of like a moment where the public school system is struggling or failing them a little bit. We're not exactly trained in this exact student population, but we are really grounded in the kinds of gender transformative, feminist, discussion curriculum that we've been talking about. And so we created a program over 2 academic years that sort of seemed to work in that setting, that addressed the gender-related themes that were important to us, and that also spoke to the needs of that particular classroom in that school.
So after our first year in the self-advocacy class, we had an opportunity to go back with a new faculty member that we had met with over the summer, had really developed a great relationship with her, and our curriculum was sort of integrated into her larger curriculum, so it wasn't us just dropping in once a week. The issues that we were going to be talking about were sort of set up throughout their courses before we got there, and then would continue to be talked about. And I think hitting on a lot of the sort of questions that have been coming out, we developed, it was one semester, we were there every Thursday morning, and we were there for 2 class periods, and it was gendered. There was a boys group and then a girls group, and it was designed in a way that it was a safe space for them, and that they were able to get into some issues that the school, felt would the kids would be more open if it was gendered. And so knowing that that was the reality of the classroom, in part we designed 3 modules. Each one was about 3 to 4 weeks. The first one was about power, and most of the students were sophomores. There were some that were a little bit older, some freshmen. And so what was really salient for them was intimate relationships. And so we got into the issue of power in relationships, but that also helped us to look at power at different levels. What does power look like within the school? Who has control? Who dictates what happens here? Then that also helped us look at the family. So then we could start talking about how do you bring these topics home? What does it look like if you were to share some of these ideas with your parents? And we had some very frank discussions about the information that people were getting, which was often not in a constructive way, about their identities. And then starting to talk about power in the community. A lot of the students came from neighborhoods that had experienced police violence, where people they know, people in their community had been killed by the Minneapolis Police Department. That was something very real in the classroom that we were able to unpack and investigate with them. Then from that, we moved into identity, which very much focused on gender identity, particularly with the boys group, really trying to unpack the messages of toxic masculinity that they were receiving, and talking about where that comes from. If it doesn't resonate with you, what do you do with it? How do you define who you want to be? And then moving into, because the course was called self-advocacy, so we had a module where we ran with that name, where it was really about taking these ideas of power, these concepts around who do you want to be, and then what do you want to do with that? And so this idea of how do you become a change maker in your community, in your family, in the school, really what can you do with your power to make some kind of tangible, noticeable, real, or significant in whatever way it is for you, difference? In whatever your sphere of influence is, how can you run with that?
Pretty much every week, the first activity that we would do, we would start with a check-in of everybody in the room, and the question that we asked upon check-in every week was, what's one thing that happened that made you feel powerful this week, or feel powerful today? And it particularly with this population, it was never going to be anything too grandiose, but like, I made a 3-pointer in gym class today, and like, I felt really great at that point. Or even for a lot of students, I showed up to school today is like what made them feel powerful, that quite a lot of the students were not coming to school very regularly. And some would come only for this particular class session because that was the only place where they could be heard a little bit. Just an example of kind of the way the discussions came, and to get around to our title of our session being Bold, Not Bogus, we found that, the power and control wheels that are out there and available, and the kind of equality wheels that are meant to be the positive version of that, are written in pretty inaccessible language for teens, even the teen one. And so we kind of created our own by telling a story of an abusive relationship, and at every certain point kind of asking the students to name what was healthy or what was unhealthy about that story that we were concocting. And at a certain point, one student, every single time we paused, he kept saying that I guess it was Romeo was the name of we called it Romeo and Juliet, this example relationship, but this guy kept saying, man, Romeo is being bogus. He's so bogus. Every action that Romeo did was bogus. And so this became rather than the power and control wheel and the equality wheel, we had the bogus wheel. And this is all the ways that you're bogus or abusive in a relationship. And then a facilitated discussion about what would equality look like, what would be positive. And the word bold also came from the students themselves, that in the first year of the program, one student kind of came out of his shell toward the end of the year, and in a final class session, summarized a lot of what we were trying to say about this confident, powerful identity that's able to make change in his world. And he said, man, don't hate me because I'm brave and bold. Don't hate me because I'm brave and bold. So then that became the tagline for that first year, and we kind of brought bold in. Now you could read brave and bold as a kind of like masculine thing as well, but in this case it really meant I'm going to be who I want to be in the community. Yeah, in terms of evaluation, so to speak, that's I'm a researcher in my background too, so I wanted to bring some kind of awareness to see, look, is this something that we should even be doing? Are there any positive outcomes here? Is this a worthwhile use of our and the students' time? So we did really talk in depth with the teachers and the teaching assistants who were there with us in the classroom every single time we were there, and also did a little bit of the, specifically related to the themes of power, identity, and self-advocacy, some agree, disagree, kind of pre and post-test things. The results, such as they are in an evaluation with a teeny sample like this, are pretty mixed. We were able to move the needle a bit on this, controlling attitude. We were able to move the needle about imagining that you could have a gay friend, that like you really have respect for people with different sexual preference and identities. And in a lot of other cases, not really a lot of measurable change, but we felt that we made a connection all the same. And in what the professionals in the room, the teaching assistants and teachers told us, they kind of give a picture of this mixed result. So, teaching assistant. I know for me, it was really inspiring when you guys started out the classes asking what made us feel powerful that week. I think by you doing that, whether or not everyone realized it, it probably opened up or maybe broke down some barriers. They were becoming more used to that practice of noticing things about themselves in a positive way. And the teacher, with a similar kind of idea, look, the topics opened a door for them, but our students are really strong-willed. I did think that they'd comprehend the different aspects of power, particularly within a relationship or a romantic relationship. Their knowledge of the idea of power within a familial relationship is not really existent, even just the idea of healthy or unhealthy power within a family. So we're opening up that conversation. Yeah, Brett?
So in spending 16 weeks in the classroom and then also engaging with SVC, where we came from, we actually did a very similar version of this presentation at the MinCasa symposium, talking about similar topics. Part of what we were hoping might come out of that was some discussion about how do you fund these efforts. We were maybe thinking there'd be money in the room. Shocking, there was not. So what are some of the challenges that exist in this work? There was, like Brian said, the limited institutional support of SVC. It's just not really within what that organization is structured to do. There is not a lot of funding generally for prevention work. We did a little bit of exploring of outside funding and grants, but then it kind of just became beyond the capacity of 2 volunteer advocates to really take that on. So how do we fund this work and make it sustainable, make it replicable, scalable? This one in particular was dependent on informal relationships. There was very minimal buy-in from the school itself. At the beginning of the semester, we had pitched to them, we're doing this with the self-advocacy group. It's a very segmented population. Like Brian said, it's already a fairly stigmatized population. And so we said we believe that this is material that should be that everyone should have access to. We could do this in the health classes, we could do this in history or social studies, we could adapt this to fit just about any content area, and I said, even please give me the challenge of how do I make this applicable in math class. And I do have ideas, but I'll save that for later. But they kind of didn't bite. The health instructors were sort of used to, they had their curriculum, they had the agencies that they were used to coming in who would do one session for them, so then they could, have to not teach a session. And it just, they were largely uninterested. And that, it was a bummer. But success, like Brian and I are so incredibly proud of the curriculum that we created. We would love to share it and to have it. It could very easily be replicated. It pulls a lot from Manhood 2.0 and similar other curriculum. We know from our experience in the classroom, we don't have amazing quantitative data, but we saw by our interactions with these students over time, the way that they saw power and the way that they saw themselves was redefined. And it changed their interactions with each other, with us, with the faculty. There was definitely a significant change in the way that they saw masculinity. It may not necessarily change their day-to-day because they still exist in a context where they have to survive. But we could tell that they were thinking about it and that their outlook was changing. And really the fact that we built something from nothing, we had an opportunity and we ran with it, was a really important moment for us.
Yeah, so deep breath. You've given us such incredible attention throughout this, and just to kind of like loop all the way back to the beginning, we started our journey here this afternoon by really naming and identifying some of those structures of the most rigid, call it toxic, definitions of masculinity and manhood that we know to be salient among young people in the United States. And we've talked about in Pittsburgh and in Minneapolis two very different logistical approaches to transform these things with high school age participants, but two approaches that use that same gender transformative idea at the core of them. With this as the kind of like named big bad enemy that we're addressing.
So if the man box is sort of the reality that we acknowledge that we live in right now, when we were creating the MinCasa presentation, it was sort of, it left a little bit of a bad taste in my mouth that that's how we start, and we didn't have sort of a great thing to replace that with. And so we came up with this idea, if we start with the man box, what is the point of all of this work? Is to highlight that there are as many masculinities or femininities and everything in between as there are individuals. And so through this work, what we're really trying to do is replace those concepts of what are we trying to foster in each other, foster in our kids and our students and the people that we work with. And so really trying to highlight these really positive traits that we would love to see in everybody and in ourselves. And so replacing those really hateful words with instead these really positive statements. You matter, I support you, I respect you, you are loved. Like that's why we do this work, is because we want everyone to feel that. And then instead of these really violent actions, the way that messages manifest into self-harm, intimate partner violence, if instead it manifests into this, into having agency, believing in nonviolence and partnership and empathy, and instead of having the man box that everyone has to fit into, instead everyone has the agency, if they choose to identify as a man, that they have their own man box, that there is a man box for every person who chooses to identify with this. And for those who don't, they have their own definitions of who they are. And that is, we started a little bit with the warning of the binary. This is one of the ways that we're working to try to break it down. And so we really wanted to sort of leave more so on this type of messaging instead of the really harmful messages that we know are all out there. And so with that.
Yeah, I think that's about it. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you for listening to this Prevent Connect podcast. Prevent Connect is a project of the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, with funding from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The views presented on Prevent Connect are not necessarily the views of the United States government, the CDC, or CalCASA. To learn more about Prevent Connect, visit www.preventconnect.org. For more information about CalCASA's mission, or to show your support, visit calcasa.org. That's CalCasa.org.